The old woman didn't look like someone who could change the course of a man's life. She was small, hunched, moving with the careful slowness of someone who had lived long enough to know that the world doesn't slow down for you. Her name was Rosa Delgado, 80 years old, white hair pinned neatly beneath a black scarf, a wooden cane in her right hand, a rosary in her left. And on that warm Tuesday evening in Palermo, Sicily, she walked into the most dangerous restaurant in the city and sat down right next to the most feared man in all of southern Italy. His name was Vincent Marcello. And nobody sat next to Vincent Marcello without being invited. But Rosa didn't know that. Or maybe she did, and she sat down anyway. What happened next in that quiet corner of Trattoria del Mare would ripple through the streets of Palermo for years to come. It would change Vincent. It would change his entire organization. And it would reveal something about power that most men spend their whole lives never understanding. Stay with this story, because it goes places you will not expect. Before we go any further, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Every single week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about power, humanity, and the moments that change everything. You do not want to miss what is coming. Now, let us get back to Palermo. To understand what happened that night, you first need to understand who Vincent, the Stone Marcello, was. He did not earn that nickname by accident. Vincent was born in 1971 in a narrow stone house in the back streets of Palermo, the third son of a fisherman who came home drunk more nights than he came home sober. From the time Vincent was 7 years old, he learned one thing above everything else in this world: only the strong survive. By the time he was 16, he was running errands for the Calabresi family, one of Sicily's oldest and most ruthless crime organizations. By 22, he had risen faster than anyone before him, not because he was the most violent, not because he was the most reckless, but because he was sharp, calculated, patient. Where other men reacted with rage, Vincent responded with silence. Where other men made threats, Vincent simply waited. And when Vincent Marcello waited, something always happened. Something that sent a clear message without a single word ever being spoken. That was why they called him the Stone: cold, unmovable, unreadable. By his 40s, Vincent controlled the port of Palermo, 3 construction companies, 2 hotels, and had enough political connections to make prosecutors sweat through their suits whenever his name came up in conversation. He had never been convicted of a single crime, not one. He had a wife, Elena, a quiet, elegant woman who asked very few questions. He had 2 sons, both educated in Rome, both kept far from the business. And he had a table. A specific table. In the back corner of Trattoria del Mare, a small seafood restaurant owned by his cousin Gio. Every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, Vincent Marcello sat at that table, alone, with a glass of Nero d'Avola wine and a plate of fresh swordfish. He read the newspaper, he thought, and everyone in that restaurant, the staff, the regulars, even the occasional tourist who wandered in, knew to leave that corner of the room completely alone. It was an unspoken rule, understood by everyone. Everyone except Rosa Delgado. Rosa arrived at Trattoria del Mare at exactly 7:15 that Tuesday evening. She had never been there before. She had passed it 100 times on her walks through the neighborhood, but a restaurant like this, with its white linen tablecloths and the smell of expensive wine drifting through its open windows, had never felt like a place for a woman like her. But that night Rosa's feet ached. Her hip, which had been replaced 3 years ago and had never quite felt right since, was sending sharp little protests up her side with every step. And when she looked through the window and saw the empty chair, the one across from the well-dressed man sitting alone in the corner, something in her simply said, "Sit down." So she did. The waiter, a young man named Piero, went pale the moment he saw her settle into that chair. He started toward her immediately, ready to redirect her as gently as possible to literally anywhere else in the restaurant. But Vincent raised one hand, just slightly, and Piero stopped, turned around, went back to the kitchen. Vincent looked at the old woman over the top of his newspaper. She was arranging her cane carefully against the wall. She set her small black handbag on the table. She smoothed her skirt. Then she looked up directly at him with eyes that were dark and clear and entirely unafraid. "I hope you don't mind," she said simply in the Sicilian dialect of his childhood. "My feet are tired." Vincent said nothing. Rosa looked around the restaurant with mild curiosity, as if she were a woman simply observing the world. Then she looked back at him. "You have kind eyes," she said. "People with kind eyes always look serious, but the eyes don't lie." Vincent set down his newspaper. In 30 years, no one had ever said anything remotely like that to him, not to his face, not at his table. He should have sent her away. Every instinct, every protocol, every rule he had built around himself said, "Send her away." Instead, he heard himself say, "Are you hungry?" Rosa smiled. It was a slow, warm smile, the kind that belonged to grandmothers and old photographs. "I haven't had a proper meal since Sunday," she said quietly. Vincent called Piero over. He ordered for her the swordfish, the bread, a small glass of wine. Rosa protested the wine. Vincent said it was good for the blood. Rosa considered this seriously, then agreed. They sat in near silence as she ate, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have both lived long enough to know that not every moment needs to be filled with words. When Rosa had finished, she folded her napkin neatly and looked at him again. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "No," Vincent agreed. "Why did you?" He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, which itself was unusual for a man who operated almost entirely on instinct and calculation. "I don't know," he finally said. Rosa nodded, as if that was the most honest answer she had heard in a long time. Then she leaned forward slightly, and she whispered something. 4 words. 4 words that Vincent Marcello would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Your mother would approve." Vincent's mother had died 17 years earlier. Her name had been Giulia. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with the same kind of quiet, unshakable dignity that Rosa carried. She had raised 4 boys in poverty, kept the family together through her husband's drinking. His absences, his failures. She had worked every day of her life. She had never asked anyone for anything. And she had died without ever knowing, or at least without ever saying, exactly what her 3rd son had become. That had been the one weight Vincent carried that no amount of power, money, or control could ever lift. When Rosa whispered those 4 words, something happened behind Vincent's eyes, something almost imperceptible, a slight tightening around the jaw, a single slow blink. "How did you know about my mother?" he asked, his voice very quiet. Rosa looked at him calmly. "I didn't," she said, "but I know men who carry their mothers with them. You're one of them, I can see it." She stood up then, collecting her handbag, reaching for her cane. She was unhurried, unafraid, as if she had simply stopped in for a meal and a conversation with an old acquaintance. "Good night," she said. "Thank you for the swordfish." And she walked out. Vincent sat at his table for a long time after she left. His wine went untouched. Piero hovered nervously nearby, unsure what had just happened, unsure what it meant. The following Tuesday, Vincent arrived at 7 o'clock, as always. Rosa arrived at 7:15. This time, Piero had her usual chair ready before she even reached the table. They didn't speak much that second evening, or the third, but they shared the table every Tuesday, and slowly, the way stones are worn smooth by water over time, Vincent Marcello began to talk. He didn't talk about the business. He never talked about the business. But he talked about Palermo, about the neighborhood where he grew up, about his sons in Rome and how he sometimes didn't recognize the men they were becoming, about the sea, which he loved but rarely had time to sit beside anymore, about a dog he'd had as a boy named Rocco, who had been his only real friend for 3 years of his childhood. Rosa listened. She talked too about her late husband Stefano, a carpenter who built beautiful things and made her laugh every single day for 41 years. About her daughter in Naples who called every Sunday. About the garden she kept on her small balcony, the tomatoes she grew every summer, the basil that always tried to take over everything else. She was, Vincent realized, one of the most genuinely content people he had ever met. Not happy in the shallow, performed way that people around him often performed happiness, but content, deeply, quietly rooted content, the kind that comes from a life lived honestly, with love at its center. It disturbed him in a way he could not quite name. It was on the 8th Tuesday that Marco Bianchi entered the picture. Marco was not from Palermo. He was a younger man, 38 years old, sharp-suited, with the overconfident energy of someone who had risen quickly in a rival organization and had not yet learned that speed and power are not the same thing. He had been sent to Palermo to deliver a message to Vincent, a territorial message, the kind that was meant to establish dominance, to test the boundaries, to see if the stone had perhaps grown soft with age. But when Marco's men surveilled Vincent's movements to find the right moment for their approach, they noticed something unexpected. Every Tuesday evening, the most feared man in Sicily sat at a restaurant table with a frail old woman. Marco saw an opportunity. He didn't understand what he was looking at. He saw vulnerability where there was none. He saw a weak point where there was actually something far more dangerous than any weapon. On the 9th Tuesday, two of Marco's men followed Rosa home from the restaurant. They didn't approach her, not yet. They were simply establishing a message. We know where you are. We know who matters to you. We can reach the things you care about. It was a classic move, crude, effective, used by men without the imagination to find any other kind of leverage. The problem was that Vincent's men saw them do it. And one of them made a phone call. By 10 o'clock that Tuesday night, Vincent knew everything, where Marco's men had come from, where they were staying, what the message was meant to say. He sat in his study for a long time. A year ago, even 6 months ago, his response would have been immediate and decisive, the kind of response that ended conversations permanently. But something had shifted in him over those 8 Tuesday evenings. Something Rosa had said during their 3rd week together, when he had mentioned offhandedly that in his experience, the only language people truly respected was force. Rosa had tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was about to say something she had thought carefully about. The people who fear you respect the force, she had said, but they don't respect you. There's a difference. Respect that comes from fear disappears the moment the fear does, but respect that comes from who you actually are. She had paused, looking out at the street. That's the kind that stays. Vincent had said nothing at the time. He had filed it away in the place where he filed things he wasn't ready to examine. Now, sitting in his study at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, he examined it. He picked up the phone. He made 2 calls. The first call was to his most trusted man, a quiet, methodical figure named Salvo, who had been with him for 25 years. He gave Salvo specific instructions, not the kind that ended things permanently, the kind that established, clearly and without violence, exactly where the lines were. The second call he made surprised everyone who later heard about it. He called the chief of the local Carabinieri, the Italian military police, a man named Captain Ferretti, with whom Vincent had maintained a careful, mutually understood distance for many years. Vincent told him, without details, that a woman named Rosa Delgano, who lived on Via Amendola, needed to be checked on, quietly, regularly. Captain Ferretti paused for a moment. "Consider it done," he said. The following Tuesday, Vincent arrived at the restaurant early. When Rosa walked in at 7:15, she found him sitting differently than usual. Not with his newspaper, not with his wine, just sitting, his hands folded on the table, his eyes thoughtful. She settled into her chair. Piero brought her tea without being asked. "Someone followed you home last week," Vincent said quietly. Rosa nodded slowly. I know, she said. I noticed. He studied her face. You weren't frightened. I was, she said simply, but I'm 80 years old. I've been frightened before, it passes. Vincent was quiet for a moment. It won't happen again, he said. Rosa looked at him steadily. Because of you. He didn't answer, which was, of course, its own answer. Rosa wrapped both hands around her cup of tea. She was quiet for a long moment. Can I tell you something? She finally said. Yes. When Stefano died, my husband, I was lost for almost 2 years, completely lost. I didn't know who I was without him. We had been together since I was 19. He was the structure of my life. She paused. And then one day I was sitting in my garden, looking at my tomatoes, and I thought, the tomatoes don't know Stefano is gone. They just grow. They just do what they were made to do. She looked up at Vincent. I think people are like that too. Underneath everything, underneath all the things that happen to us, all the roles we play, all the ways we protect ourselves, there's just a person, doing what they were made to do. The question is whether you ever figure out what that actually is. The restaurant was quiet around them. Someone was washing dishes in the kitchen. Outside, Palermo hummed with its ordinary evening life. What do you think I was made to do? Vincent asked. And it was perhaps the most genuinely open question he had asked anyone in 30 years. Rosa smiled at him, that slow, warm smile. I think you were made to protect people, she said. I think that's what you've always been doing in the only way you knew how, but there are other ways. Vincent looked down at his hands, the hands that had built an empire, the hands that had signed decisions he could never fully take back, the hands that had, inexplicably, ordered swordfish for a tired old woman on a Tuesday evening 8 weeks ago. It's too late, he said quietly, for other ways. It's never too late, Rosa said firmly. I'm 80 years old, I know this for certain. No one in Palermo could quite explain what happened to Vincent Marcello in the years that followed. He didn't disappear from the life overnight. That wasn't how it worked, but things changed, slowly, quietly, in the way that real change always happens, not in dramatic declarations, but in 100 small decisions made differently than they would have been before. He pulled back from the most dangerous parts of the operation, handed responsibilities to others, used his considerable connections to redirect certain business interests toward things that existed entirely in the daylight, construction projects, a shipping company, a foundation that funded scholarships for boys from poor families in the Palermo neighborhoods where he had grown up. His son Luca, the younger one, who had always been the more curious of the two, came back from Rome one summer and spent 3 months working alongside him. It was the longest stretch of uninterrupted time they had spent together since Luca was a child. At the end of the summer, Vincent told him things he had never told anyone. Not everything, but enough. Enough to close a distance that had been growing for 20 years. Marco Bancia and his organization, meanwhile, discovered that their leverage had evaporated completely. The message Salvo delivered was received clearly. They did not return to Palermo. And every Tuesday at 7:15, Rosa Dolgunna walked into Trattoria del Mare and sat down across from Vincent Marcello. Per, who had worked at the restaurant for 11 years and had seen many extraordinary things, later said that watching those two eat dinner together every week was the most quietly remarkable thing he had ever witnessed. The most feared man in Sicily and a tiny 80-year-old woman with a wooden cane and a rosary, sharpening swordfish and bread and conversation like two old friends who had known each other their entire lives. On the evening of Russ's 81st birthday, Vincent arranged something small. He told her it was nothing. He had asked the restaurant to prepare her favcrata dessert, a cassata, a traditional Sicilian cake with ricotta and candied fruit, and he had placed on the table, without comment, a small potted basil plant. Because she had told him, weeks earlier, that the basil on her balcony kept trying to take over everything else, and she loved it for that. Rosa looked at the basil plant for a long moment, then she looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Your mother would be very proud, she said. not a whisper this time, clearly, warmly, with absolute certainty. And Vincent Marcello, the stone, the most feared man in all of southern Italy, looked at the small plant on the white linen tablecloth and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very, very long time. Something that felt unmistakably like peace. Russa Dolgunna walked into that restaurant because her feet were tired. She sat down next to a man the entire city was afraid of, and she saw not the power, not the reputation, not the empire, but the person underneath it all. The boy who had loved a dog named Rucka, the son who carried his mother with him everywhere, the man who, beneath decades of stone, still had kind eyes. And in doing so, she gave him something no amount of money or fear or control had ever been able to buy him. She gave him the chance to be seen. We spend so much of our lives building walls, armor, reputations. We become the roles we play until we forget there was ever anything underneath them. And sometimes it takes the most unlikely person, a tired old woman with a wooden cane and a rosary, to sit down next to us and simply say, "I see you, the real you, and it is not too late." Vincent Marcello spent the last chapter of his life building something different from what he had built before. And every Tuesday evening, he shared swordfish and silence with the woman who had made it possible. Some people change the world loudly, with force, with fear, with power that announces itself at every door. And some people change it quietly, with a whispered word across a restaurant table, with a basil plant placed gently on a white linen cloth, with eyes that see past every wall a person has ever built. Russa never thought of herself as brave. She was just tired and hungry, and she saw an empty chair. That is all it takes sometimes. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not subscribed yet, we tell stories like this every single week. Hit that subscribe button and join the family. You will not regret it.